I woke up before dawn, the house still asleep and cloaked in that heavy silence that had settled ever since Robert passed away 5 years ago. It was 5:30 a.m., the kind of hour when the world feels paused, suspended between night and day. I reached for my cup of chamomile tea on the bedside table, the steam curling gently upward, and settled into the rocking chair Robert had built long ago, its worn wood creaking softly beneath me. The quiet was thick, but there was a comfort in it, a stillness that wrapped around me like a familiar shawl. Through the window, I watched the sun begin its slow climb over the oaks that stood like sentinels on our small property in Millfield. The golden light spilled across the lawn, touching the dew-soaked grass, the branches, and the faded wooden fence that had seen more seasons than I cared to count. I let out a breath, feeling the weight of years settle into my bones, but also the steady beat of a heart that refused to give up. Today was the Stewardship meeting at Grace Eternal Church. I had been a part of that congregation for over 40 years, nearly my entire adult life since Robert and I moved into this town. I seldom missed a meeting. In fact, they were some of the few moments when I felt truly connected, a part of something greater than myself. At 68, my body wasn't as spry as it used to be, but my mind was sharp, and my spirit still held firm to the faith Robert and I had built together. I rose from the chair and shuffled over to the small chest of drawers in the corner of the room, pulling open the bottom drawer where I kept a thin, yellowed folder. Its edges were frayed, the paper brittle with age, but inside was the deed that Robert and I had kept hidden for all these years. It was the legal ownership of the parish hall, a building that had meant so much to us and to the community, but one that had always been quietly shrouded in secrecy. Robert was a man of humility, a man of faith who believed that acts of service needed no applause or trophy. When he and I had donated the land and money to build the hall, it was under the condition that ownership would remain ours, even as the church used the space freely. The old pastor at the time, a kindly man named Father Michaels, had understood this and had kept the secret. That was 40 years ago, and now it felt like that secret was about to unravel. I folded the folder carefully and placed it back. I dressed in my navy blue dress, the one I'd saved for special occasions, and pinned my hair into a low bun. Looking in the mirror, I saw the reflection of a woman shaped by decades, wrinkles mapped out like lines of scripture, eyes that had witnessed joy and sorrow, lips that had prayed and protested in equal measure. As I stepped outside, the morning air was cool but promising. The streets of Millfield were waking up. Neighbors were starting their day, the distant hum of traffic a gentle reminder of the world beyond our quiet town. Grace Eternal Church sat at the end of Maple Street, its white steeple catching the sun like a beacon. At the church entrance, Pastor Gregory Hampton waited. He always wore a crisp suit, today gray with a blue tie, and his smile was practiced, polished but somehow empty. I greeted him politely, though my heart tightened at the thought of what this meeting might bring. I'd heard the whispers, the rumors that he wanted to change the way the parish hall was being used, turning it into a source of income, perhaps at the expense of the community programs that had long been a lifeline for so many. Inside the church hall, the meeting room was already filling with familiar faces. Sarah Wilson sat quietly near the back, her warm eyes shadowed with concern. Diacono Matthew, ever gracious and earnest, was scanning through papers. Richard Blackwell, the church treasurer, looked as he always did, serious, ready to argue figures and balance sheets with precise calculation. Pastor Hampton began the meeting with his usual confident tone. He spoke of growth, sustainability, and the need to adapt to changing times. His words were smooth but carried an edge of urgency. The parish hall, he said, is a valuable asset. We must consider ways to maximize its potential. My stomach twisted as he laid out his plan. To rent the space for corporate events, to charge fees for weddings, and to limit free access for community groups. He argued it was practical, necessary. The era of unrestricted charity, he stated firmly, is over. I glanced at Sarah, who squeezed my hand under the table. She knew what those walls meant to me. The countless hours Robert and I had spent dreaming about how that hall would serve the people of Millfield. It was more than a building. It was a sanctuary, a place where lives had been uplifted. Richard jumped in, his voice steady but animated. He spoke of numbers and projections, how opening the doors to paying clients could triple the church's income. The hall has been underutilized, he said, and we need to be responsible stewards of our resources. Underutilized. Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. That hall feeds families every week. It houses support groups for widows and single mothers. It's not just a building, it's a lifeline. Pastor Hampton's gaze flicked to me then, sharp and expectant. Mrs. Bennet, I understand your attachment. But we must be realistic. The church is not a charity case. It's an institution that must survive. Something inside me clenched, a familiar ache that had been simmering for months. 40 years of quiet service, of giving without seeking recognition, felt suddenly fragile. Robert had always said that true charity was between the giver and God. But what if the gift was being taken for granted? What if the purpose was being lost? When the room quieted, I reached into my bag and pulled out the worn folder. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice held steady. Pastor, I said, there's something I need to share. All eyes turned to me. The room seemed to hold its breath. This parish hall, I continued, placing the deed on the oak table, has never belonged to the church. There was a pause, long and charged. Then Richard leaned forward, eyes narrowing. What do you mean? I mean that Robert and I donated the use of this building, but not the ownership, I said. The deed is in my name and his. It has been for 40 years. Pastor Hampton reached out and snatched the document, his fingers brushing the paper as he scanned it quickly. His face drained of color. This can't be, he muttered, disbelief thick in his voice. Richard took the deed, adjusting his glasses, and read it carefully. The silence in the room grew heavier, more oppressive. It's legal, he said softly. Mrs. Bennet and her late husband are the rightful owners. The murmurs began. Disbelief, confusion, astonishment. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she gripped my arm. Why didn't you say anything before? She asked. I swallowed hard, a lump in my throat. Robert believed that true service was humble. He wanted no recognition. But now I see that silence has allowed the hall's purpose to be twisted. The meeting dissolved into whispers and uneasy glances. Pastor Hampton avoided my gaze, retreating into himself. For the first time in years I felt a spark of hope, fragile yes, but alive. The truth was finally out. Walking back to my car, the afternoon sun warmed my face and I thought of Robert. Somewhere I hoped he was smiling, proud not for himself, but for the community we had tried to protect. This was just the beginning, I knew. There would be battles ahead, questions to answer, hearts to mend. But as I sat behind the wheel, feeling the weight of decades lift slightly off my shoulders, I whispered a prayer. For grace. For courage. For the strength to see this through. The treasurer's hands trembled, his face as pale as wax. When I placed the deed on the oak table, silence fell over the parish hall. The very hall they had just moments before been arguing over how to exploit. I felt the weight of 40 years of silence lift as tears traced down my wrinkled cheeks. This hall belongs to me. It always has. My dear friends, thank you from the depths of my heart for taking this time to listen to my story. This channel is just beginning its journey, and every new subscriber breathes life into our shared mission. If my story touches you, please consider clicking subscribe, and if you feel comfortable, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It means the world to build this community with you. The morning light filtered softly through the lace curtains of my kitchen window, casting delicate patterns onto the worn wooden table where I sat, cradling a steaming cup of black coffee. It was the kind of quiet that felt sacred, the gentle hum of a new day beginning in Millfield. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint. There was a certain weight that came with that time. A tapestry woven of joy and sorrow, of steadfast faith and lingering doubt. Robert, my late husband, had been my partner in all of it. Together, we had laid down roots not only in this town but in the very soul of the church community. He was a carpenter by trade, with hands roughened by years of shaping wood into things of beauty and purpose. I could still remember how, decades ago, he had painstakingly crafted the very pews we sat on every Sunday and helped build the parish hall, brick by brick, beam by beam. It was more than a building to us. It was a promise, a legacy of hope and service. Now, 5 years after Robert's passing, I found myself settling deeper into the rhythms he had helped establish, holding on to the memories even as the silence in the house grew heavier. The mornings began early, much earlier than they ever had before. I would rise before dawn, the world still steeped in darkness, and prepare myself quietly for the day ahead. Today was the stewardship meeting at the church, a meeting I rarely missed, no matter how tired or frail I sometimes felt. The meeting had taken on new significance in recent months, and I sensed a storm brewing beneath the surface of our peaceful congregation. The kitchen was warm, the gentle clinking of my spoon against the coffee cup the only sound besides the occasional chirp of birds outside. I let my eyes drift to the small wooden cross hanging above the sink, a gift from Robert on our 10th wedding anniversary. It had been his way of reminding me, and maybe himself, that our faith was the foundation beneath everything we built, both literally and figuratively. I took a slow sip, the bitterness of the coffee grounding me. The house was still, but the church bells rang again, a soft peal this time, signaling the approaching hour for morning prayer. That sound, so familiar and steady, always reminded me of the countless times I had knelt in that sanctuary, whispering prayers for guidance, for strength. It was a sanctuary not just of bricks and mortar, but of shared hope and quiet courage. Living in Millfield was living among stories. Every face in the congregation carried one, and I had learned to listen, not just to words but to silences, to the tremors beneath smiles, to the weight of unspoken burdens. Sarah Wilson, my dearest friend and fellow volunteer, was one of those stories. She had been by my side through so many seasons, her presence a balm in the hardest moments. Her laughter had filled the church hall during our potluck dinners. Her steady hands had packed countless food boxes alongside mine. She was older now, like me, her hair a crown of soft white curls, her eyes reflecting a depth of wisdom and compassion. And then there was Deacon Matthew Collins, the young man who had taken on more responsibility in recent years. His energy was a bright contrast to our quiet endurance, a spark that reminded me of the church's future. I admired his sincerity, how he greeted everyone with a genuine smile, how his hands trembled ever so slightly when he read scripture aloud from his worn Bible. He was a link between past and present, carrying forward what we had begun. But the presence that loomed largest in my thoughts was Pastor Gregory Hampton. He was a man of vision, or so he claimed, but his vision felt like a shadow falling over the community I had known all my life. The pastor's plans to change the parish hall, our parish hall, into a profit-making venture unsettled me deeply. The very idea of turning a place that had cradled so many of our shared sorrows and joys into a corporate rental space felt like a betrayal, a fracture in the heart of our church. Yet, I also understood that times were changing. The old ways of running things, relying solely on goodwill and donations, no longer seemed enough to sustain the church's growing needs. The economy shifted, the congregation's demographics shifted, and with it, the needs and challenges of maintaining a community space shifted too. Pastor Hampton spoke of growth, of financial stability, of preparing the church for the future, but I feared that in chasing those goals, something essential might be lost. This tension had settled over our meetings like a heavy fog, thickening with every whispered conversation and wary glance. I found myself wrestling with a complex mix of emotions: loyalty and doubt, hope and fear, love and frustration. The parish hall was more than a building. It was a symbol of all that Robert and I had given, a testament to a different kind of stewardship, one rooted in sacrifice, humility, and faith. On this morning, as I finished my coffee, I felt the familiar ache in my chest, the weight of unspoken truths that had grown heavier with time. 40 years of silence had carved deep lines into my heart, and yet today, something inside me stirred. The truth about the parish hall's ownership, a secret Robert and I had kept for decades, pressed against the walls of my conscience like a breath that refused to be held. I stood and stretched slowly, feeling the stiffness that age brings but also the steady pulse of determination. I carefully gathered the day's papers and the small, worn leather purse that had accompanied me through countless meetings. As I stepped toward the door, the scent of spring filled the air. A promise of renewal, perhaps, or a reminder that even the oldest trees in our churchyard had once been saplings. The walk to Grace Eternal Church was familiar, yet today every step felt charged with quiet resolve. The sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows across Maple Street. Neighbors greeted me with nods and smiles, their eyes reflecting the same mix of curiosity and concern I felt. The church steeple stood tall against the sky, a beacon of faith and community amidst the changing tides. Inside the parish hall, the air was thick with anticipation. The chatter of familiar voices blended with the rustle of papers and the soft clearing of throats. I found Sarah seated near the back, her eyes bright but shadowed with worry. She offered me a small, encouraging smile as I took my place, her hand briefly squeezing mine under the table. Deacon Matthew sat to my right, his brow furrowed in thought, fingers tapping nervously against the wood surface. At the front, Pastor Hampton arranged his notes, his expression composed, yet there was a sharpness in his gaze that unsettled me. As the meeting began, I tried to still the flutter of anxiety in my stomach. This place, the parish hall, had been a sanctuary for so many, a refuge where hope had been nurtured and burdens shared. But now it seemed the foundation was shifting beneath our feet, and I was caught between past loyalty and present responsibility. I remembered the promise Robert and I had made so long ago, the quiet pact with the church's former pastor, Father Michaels. The land and the building had been our gift, yes, but with a condition, one so carefully worded and so deeply personal that we had kept it secret, fearing that the spirit of the gift might be lost if ownership passed entirely into institutional hands. The hall had been meant to serve, to feed, to teach, to gather, to heal. It was a place where the vulnerable found shelter, where hands were held in prayer, and where faith was lived in action. The thought of it being reshaped into a business, a source of income with contracts and fees, filled me with a sorrow that settled deep into my bones. And yet in that sorrow there was also a growing strength, a whispered urging from the memory of a man I loved, a calling to stand for what was right, even if it meant breaking decades of silence. As the voices raised in debate, as arguments were made for progress and practicality, I held on to that quiet strength. The parish hall was more than walls and roof. It was the heart of our community, and today, I would find the courage to protect it. I took a deep breath, feeling the roughness of the wooden table beneath my fingers. Outside, the church bells rang once more, their clear tones weaving through the heavy air. They called us to worship, to witness, to be stewards not only of property but of faith itself. And in that moment I knew the time had come to speak, to reveal the truth that had been kept hidden for too long, to reclaim a legacy not for pride, but for love. The morning had begun in quiet reflection, but it would not end that way. Today the parish hall's story would change forever, and mine along with it. The room was already thick with tension before the meeting even officially began. I could feel it pressing down on me, like the heavy summer humidity that clings to your skin and won't let go. The parish hall, with its faded floral curtains and scuffed wooden floors, had always been a place of warmth and community, a refuge. But today it felt different. The familiar smell of polished wood was mixed with something else, the scent of ambition, of change, and I feared of loss. As I settled into my seat at the long oak table, my fingers brushed the smooth surface, seeking some small comfort. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady but edged with urgency. "As you know, our congregation is growing, and with growth comes responsibility. We must ensure the sustainability of our ministries and facilities." He paused, glancing around the room, eyes lingering momentarily on me. I felt my heart flutter, a sudden tightening in my chest that made it hard to breathe. My hands, resting on the table, grew clammy. I swallowed hard and tried to steady myself. 40 years of devotion felt like a lifetime of whispers waiting to be heard. But today, those whispers threatened to turn into a storm. "The parish hall," he continued, "is a valuable asset, one that we have not fully leveraged. It's time to consider how we can make this space work harder for us." My throat tightened. I had heard the words before in other contexts, but never applied to this hall, the hall Robert and I had helped build with sweat and prayer, hoping it would remain a sanctuary for the community, not a business venture. "We propose," Pastor Hampton said, "to open the hall for rental to corporate clients, special events, and private functions. This will generate much-needed revenue to support our growing programs and to maintain the facility itself." A few heads nodded around the room. Richard cleared his throat, pushing up his glasses. "Preliminary calculations suggest that with these changes, we could triple our current income from the hall." The words hit me like a blow. Tripling income. That meant fees, contracts, restrictions. The programs Sarah and I had poured our hearts into. The weekly meals for families in need, the senior support groups, the children's tutoring sessions, would be pushed aside, replaced by paying customers and corporate events. I glanced at Sarah, who caught my eye and gave a subtle shake of her head. Her lips pressed into a thin line. I could see the hurt there, the same hurt I felt creeping up inside me. Pastor Hampton's gaze returned to me, sharp and deliberate. "Mrs. Bennett, we understand your dedication, but we must be realistic. The days of unrestricted charity are behind us. Financial stewardship is crucial for our survival." The room seemed to constrict, as if the walls themselves were closing in. My breath caught in my throat. My hands, which had been resting calmly on the table moments before, now clenched into trembling fists. The memories flooded in, Robert's hands shaping the beams, the countless nights we dreamed of a place where faith did not have a price tag. And now that dream was slipping through my fingers. Richard spoke again, his voice steady but firm. "We also need to consider limiting the use of the hall for free or low-cost programs. The maintenance and utilities alone are substantial." Sarah's voice cut through the murmur, fragile but fierce. "Those programs are the community. Without them, what are we?" Pastor Hampton's smile tightened. "I'm not dismissing the importance of those ministries, but we must find a balance. The church cannot operate in the red or rely solely on goodwill." A heavy silence fell after his words. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My hands were ice cold now, my pulse pounding in my ears. I looked down at the table, at the familiar grain of the wood, and then at the faces around me, faces I had known all my life, now contorted with doubt, fear, or calculation. And then I realized, this was the moment I had been dreading, the moment when I would have to decide whether to stay silent as the heart of our community was commodified, or to speak, to break 40 years of quiet, to stand up against a tide I could not stop alone. The room seemed to hold its breath. The ticking of the old clock on the wall was the only sound. I swallowed again, feeling the lump in my throat grow. My fingers fumbled inside my bag, seeking the worn folder I had carried with me like a talisman. The paper inside was fragile but powerful, the proof of ownership, of a promise made decades ago. I felt my eyes blur with tears, the heat of emotion rising in my chest. The air was thick, every heartbeat loud. I could almost hear Robert's voice, steady and quiet, urging me to stand firm, to protect what we had built not for pride but for love. And then with the voice that surprised even me I spoke. "Pastor Hampton," I said, my voice trembling but gaining strength. "I have something to share, something that changes everything." The room went silent, the tension crackling like static. All eyes turned toward me. I reached into my bag and carefully pulled out the yellowed folder. My hands, though shaking, were steady enough. I unfolded the deed and laid it gently on the table. "This parish hall," I said, my voice steady now, "has never belonged to the church." Gasps filled the room. Sarah's eyes widened, a mix of shock and relief washing over her face. Diacono Matthew leaned forward, brows knitting in confusion. Richard's mouth opened slightly, and even Pastor Hampton's practiced composure faltered. "This document," I continued, "shows that my late husband, Robert, and I are the legal owners of this building and the land it stands on. We donated the use of the hall to the church, but not its ownership." Pastor Hampton's face went pale. His fingers reached out, almost reflexively, to snatch the deed from the table, scanning the fragile pages with disbelief. This can't be," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard adjusted his glasses, peering closely at the document. The color drained from his face as he read the details. "Mrs. Bennet, this is legally binding. You and your husband have been the owners all along." A murmur spread through the room. Disbelief, astonishment, a flicker of admiration. People who had been so ready to change the hall's purpose now looked uncertain, caught off guard by the truth laid bare before them. Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with tears. "Why did you keep this secret for so long?" I hesitated, the weight of decades pressing down on me. Robert believed that true service should be without recognition. He wanted no fanfare, no headlines. But now, I see that silence allowed the very spirit of this place to be threatened. The room was heavy with emotion. The arguments, the plans, the ambitions, all seemed to pause in the face of this revelation. Pastor Hampton looked up, his eyes searching mine, and I saw something there. A flicker of defeat, maybe even regret. The man who had so confidently spoken of progress now seemed to confront a truth he hadn't anticipated. I took a deep breath, feeling tears sting my eyes but also a newfound clarity. This was no longer just about bricks and mortar. It was about protecting a legacy, a community built on faith, hope, and quiet sacrifice. And today I had found the courage to speak. The room remained silent for a long moment, and then slowly the tide began to turn. Conversations resumed, softer now, more thoughtful. Questions were asked, doubts expressed. But beneath it all I sensed a shift, a tentative hope that the heart of our church might yet be preserved. As I gathered my things at the meeting's close, Sarah leaned in and whispered, "Thank you, Eleanor, for standing up when no one else could." I smiled faintly, the weight on my shoulders lightening just a bit. Outside, the afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colors across the worn floorboards, a reminder that even after the darkest nights, light finds a way to shine through. And as I stepped back into the warmth of the day, I knew that the path ahead would be difficult. But I was no longer alone, and the truth was finally free. The weight of that meeting settled into my bones like a cold shadow, lingering long after the church doors closed behind me. I could still feel the rough oak table beneath my palms, hear the hushed gasps as the deed hit the surface, watch the faces around that room, so familiar yet suddenly strangers, turn pale or tighten with disbelief. It was not just the revelation itself. It was the unraveling of years of trust, the quietly built walls of assumed authority beginning to crack. That night I lay awake in bed, the ceiling above blurred by the dim light of the bedside lamp, my fingers tracing the embroidered edge of the pillowcase Robert had sewn so many years ago. My heart trembled, not from fear, but from the heaviness of what I had done. How had I carried this secret all these years? Had I been wrong to keep it? And yet, I knew deep inside that silence was never meant to be permanent. I thought back to the early days, the memories like faded photographs in my mind, The summer afternoons when Robert and I stood on that empty patch of land, watching the sun filter through the branches of the oaks. The smell of fresh-cut wood. Now, years later, I saw the truth of his words with painful clarity. Pastor Hampton, with his sharp suits and sharper words, had not come to build or nurture. He had come to take and to remake. His vision was one of contracts and ledgers, of numbers and margins. The warmth of our community was at risk of freezing beneath cold calculations. The next few days after the meeting were a storm of whispers in the church pews, furtive glances, half-spoken questions. I noticed how the younger members avoided me, uncertain how to respond to the woman who had upended their plans. I sensed the shift in the atmosphere, like a sudden chill in the air, a subtle wariness that hadn't been there before. Sarah was my anchor. She called me the morning after, her voice steady but soft. "Eleanor, you did what you had to do. I know it wasn't easy." I could hear the unspoken worry beneath her words, the fear of division, the sorrow for the battles ahead. "Sarah, it was time," I said, my voice thin but resolute. "Years of watching our hall become something it was never meant to be. We can't let that happen." She sighed. "I've known your secret for a while, but I understand why you kept it. Robert was a humble man. But people need to know the truth now." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. There was comfort in that confession, in the shared burden finally laid bare. But not everyone was so understanding. At the Sunday service, Pastor Hampton avoided my gaze entirely. His sermons, once filled with broad smiles and warm encouragement, now felt clipped, rehearsed. I caught him once in the hallway, his eyes narrowing when they landed on me, the tension between us tangible. "Mrs. Bennet," he said, voice tight but polite, "I hope we can find a way forward for the church. For all of us." I met his gaze steadily. "The church I love is built on more than profit, Pastor." He hesitated, the faintest flicker of something regret passing across his face. Then he nodded curtly and moved on. I also noticed Richard Blackwell, the treasurer, becoming quieter in meetings. He avoided direct confrontation, but there was a lingering tension in his posture, a chill behind his polite nods. The man who had once been so confident in numbers now seemed uncertain, perhaps even resentful. One afternoon, Sarah and I sat in the parish hall after a small group had gathered for prayer. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. Sarah's eyes were heavy with exhaustion and worry. "Eleanor," she said softly, "people are scared. They don't know what this means for them, the programs, the community meals, the support groups. There's talk of splitting, of starting new things outside the church." I took a slow breath. "I understand. And I fear it too. But we have to hold on to the heart of this place. Robert's vision wasn't just about bricks and land. It was about people." She squeezed my hand. "You're right. But how do we fight a tide that's already turning?" I looked around the hall, my fingers tracing the grain of the oak pews. "By remembering what this hall was built for. By standing firm together." Those words felt hollow and full at the same time. The truth was, I didn't know if we could stop the change. The church was evolving whether we liked it or not, and I was caught between the past I cherished and a future I feared. Then there was Deacon Matthew. I found him one evening by the stained glass windows, the light painting colors across his face. He looked tired, the years of responsibility weighing on him. "Mrs. Bennet," he began hesitantly, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About the hall, about ownership. It's complicated." I nodded. "I know. It's not an easy burden to carry." He looked down, rubbing the small scar above his eyebrow. "I want to protect the community, but sometimes I wonder if we're just delaying the inevitable. The church needs to survive after all." His words cut into me. The survival of the church, what did that mean? Was survival measured in dollars and cents, or in the lives we touched? I don't think survival means losing who we are, I said gently. Faith isn't a business plan. He met my eyes, a flicker of understanding there. Maybe there's a way to balance both. I smiled faintly, grateful for his hope. Maybe there is. Yet, beneath all the conversations and quiet reflections, the unresolved tension simmered. I felt the eyes of the congregation on me, some filled with gratitude, others with suspicion. I was the woman who had spoken the truth, who had shattered the assumptions of a lifetime. It was a lonely place to be. One afternoon, as I organized the food pantry with Sarah, a young mother approached us, her eyes tired but hopeful. "Mrs. Bennett, thank you," she said, clutching her toddler's hand. "My family depends on these meals. We don't have much, and the hall has been a lifeline." Her words settled into my heart. This was what it was all about, not deeds or documents but human lives. I reached out, touching the child's shoulder gently. "We'll do everything we can to keep it that way." Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat alone on the bench outside the church, the cool evening air wrapping around me. The silence was different now, not heavy with grief, but humming with quiet resolve. 40 years of service, of love, of sacrifice. The truth was no longer a secret, but a burden shared. I felt Robert's presence near, a steady hand on my shoulder, urging me forward. The path ahead was uncertain, paved with challenges I could not yet see clearly. But I knew one thing for sure. I would stand guard over the heart of this hall, for the community, for the memory of a man who believed in humble service, and for the faith that calls us to protect what truly matters. As I rose to go inside, the church bells tolled once more, their sound carrying through the stillness, a reminder that hope endures, even in the face of change. The days that followed the meeting felt like walking through fog, a dense haze that blurred the familiar contours of my life and left everything uncertain. I noticed it first in the way people's eyes shifted away when I entered a room, the quick closing of doors before I could say hello, the conversations that stopped abruptly as I approached. The warmth that had once been constant in the church halls grew thin, replaced by a brittle tension that clung to the air like a winter chill. On Sunday mornings, the pews felt colder than ever. Faces that had once greeted me with smiles now appeared guarded. Some even avoided my gaze altogether. I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, feeling the weight of invisible walls rising between me and the congregation I had served for so long. The sanctuary still smelled of polished wood and candle wax, but the spirit within it seemed strained, stretched thin by unspoken fears and fractured trust. Sarah noticed it too. One afternoon we met at the small cafe down the street, a place where we'd often shared comforting meals and laughter. But today the familiar comfort was missing. The clatter of dishes and hum of quiet conversation seemed distant, as if I were hearing them through a thick pane of glass. "Eleanor," she began gently, her eyes searching mine across the table. "I don't know if you've noticed, but people are afraid. They're scared of what this means for the church, for the programs, and for the future." I nodded slowly, stirring my tea absent-mindedly. The warmth of the mug was a small anchor in the storm inside me. "It's hard," I admitted softly. "I never expected that telling the truth would isolate me like this." Her hand reached out across the table, squeezing mine with a steady reassurance. "It's not just you. The community feels shaken. Some don't know how to process it. They're afraid of losing the church they thought they knew." I swallowed, the lump rising again in my throat. I never wanted to cause fear. Robert and I gave that hall to serve people, not to create division. Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I know. But change is scary, Eleanor. Even when it's necessary." Returning to the church the following Sunday was like stepping into a different world. The usual buzz of chatter and greetings was replaced by low murmurs and hesitant glances. I passed by familiar faces. Mrs. Turner, who had once hugged me warmly in the kitchen, now looked away as if I were a stranger. Mr. Jenkins, who'd always nodded kindly at me in the hallway, quickened his pace to disappear down a side aisle. The children I'd watched grow felt like distant echoes, their laughter muffled and faint. At the back of the sanctuary, I caught sight of Diacono Matthew. The days stretched on, each one blending into the next with a growing sense of isolation. I found myself walking the church grounds alone, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows that mirrored the loneliness creeping into my heart. The garden Robert had tended, once bursting with color and life, now seemed faded, like the community itself. Even the small acts that once brought me solace, organizing the food pantry, helping with the holiday outreach, felt burdened by the weight of uncertainty. Volunteers who had once worked side by side now hesitated, their smiles faltering when I approached. The laughter that once filled the parish hall during potluck dinners was replaced by silence, broken only by the soft rustling of papers and the occasional cough. One evening, as dusk settled over Millfield, I sat in the parish hall alone. The room was quiet, save for the soft creak of the wooden floor beneath my feet. I ran my fingers along the top of an oak pew, tracing the familiar grain that had witnessed so many prayers, so many tears. The memories pressed in around me, the faces of those we had served, the hands held in comfort, the songs sung in hope. The silence was a heavy blanket, but within it, I heard a whisper, a faint urging to keep going, to not give up on the community that had been my life. I closed my eyes and felt Robert's presence beside me, as if he were reaching out across the years to steady my hand and heart. The isolation was hard, but I knew this was only part of the journey. Truth had a cost, and I was beginning to understand just how high the price could be. But for the sake of the hall, for the sake of those who still needed it, I would bear that cost. In the weeks that followed, the tension in the church simmered beneath the surface, visible only in furtive glances and hushed conversations. I overheard fragments, concerns about finances, whispers of distrust, and the growing uncertainty that comes when a community feels its foundations trembling. One afternoon, as I arranged food boxes in the pantry, a young mother approached me. Her eyes were tired but grateful, and she clutched her child's hand tightly. "Mrs. Bennett," she said softly, "thank you for all you've done. My family has depended on these meals for so long. We don't have much, but this hall has been a lifeline." Her words sank deep into my heart, a reminder of what truly mattered. Ownership and property documents were important, but they were nothing without the people who found refuge within these walls. "I promise," I said, my voice steady. "We'll do everything we can to keep it that way." But even that promise felt fragile in the shifting tides of the church's future. The congregation was divided, uncertain, and weary. Friendships that had lasted decades now trembled under the strain of suspicion and fear. One afternoon, I found myself passing the church's small community bulletin board. A new flyer had been posted, an announcement for a meeting to discuss the future direction of the parish. The language was formal, careful, but the undertone was clear. Change was coming whether we were ready or not. I paused, my fingers brushing the edge of the flyer. The hall was my home, my legacy, and my responsibility. The challenge before me was immense, but I knew the fight to protect the community's heart had only just begun. Later that evening, I sat at my kitchen table, the soft glow of a single lamp illuminating the worn pages of the deed. I traced the letters with trembling hands, feeling again the weight of Robert's promise, and the quiet courage it had taken to keep faith in a world that often seemed to forget the meaning of true stewardship. Outside, the night was calm, the stars tracing patterns across the sky, a reminder that even in darkness, there is light to be found. I whispered a prayer, not just for the church, but for the strength to carry on when the road ahead was uncertain and the voices around me were growing faint. Because sometimes standing alone is the only way to begin to rebuild. And so I stood. I sat in the church pew long before the service was set to begin, hands folded tightly in my lap, fingers entwined like fragile threads holding me together. The soft creak of the wooden pew beneath me felt familiar, almost reassuring, But today, even that grounding comfort seemed distant. The air inside Grace Eternal was thick, charged with anticipation, like the moments before a storm breaks. I could smell the polished wood of the pulpit, a rich, warm scent mingling with the faint aroma of lilies from the altar, their delicate fragrance almost too sweet, too innocent for the tension that had settled here. My heart thudded in my chest like a drum, a steady, insistent beat that seemed louder with every breath I tried to take. I kept my breathing slow, measured, reminding myself to stay calm, to be the woman Robert had always believed I could be. My hands, those veined hands that had held his all those years ago, trembled slightly, but I forced them still, folding them one more time before tucking them quietly beneath my navy blue cardigan. Every face in the sanctuary seemed to blur, the familiar wood and stained glass fading into a backdrop against the rising flood of memories and fears. I could see the young families clustered near the front, their children squirming in restless innocence, the older couples, faces etched by decades of faith and hardship, and of course the church leadership, their eyes fixed forward, poised for the sermon that would decide the fate of the parish hall, and perhaps the soul of the church itself. Pastor Gregory Hampton's voice began, cutting through the silence like a blade. It was polished, precise, every word carefully chosen, echoing off the high ceilings and the walls that had witnessed so many prayers. His tone was steady but firm, filled with the kind of conviction that demands obedience, respect, unquestioning acceptance. "We gather today," he began, his voice resonating through the sanctuary, "to face a reality that challenges us all. Our parish is growing, our needs are changing, and we must adapt in order to thrive." The words bounced off the walls, stirring the congregation, but I felt the weight behind them. Not hope, but a cold practicality that chilled me. I clenched my hands beneath the folds of my skirt, nails pressing into my palms as I fought to keep steady. His eyes scanned the room, and for a fraction of a second they landed on me. That familiar, calculating gaze, sharp and assessing. I looked away quickly, focusing instead on the smooth grain of the pew in front of me. I could hear my own breath. Shallow, uneven, the silent battle of a heart caught between fear and resolve. "The parish hall," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "has been a cherished place for our community, but it has also been an underutilized resource. We face rising costs and expanding programs that demand new sources of income." I felt Sarah's hand brush mine, a quiet gesture of solidarity, and I squeezed it in return. We had shared so many moments in this hall. The laughter of potluck dinners, the whispered prayers in support groups, the quiet tears shared in grief and healing. The thought of those memories being overtaken by contracts and rental fees made my chest tighten painfully. Pastor Hampton's words were like a tide, pulling the congregation forward into a vision that felt foreign and harsh. To secure the future of our ministries, I propose we open the parish hall to outside events, corporate gatherings, weddings, celebrations. This will provide the revenue necessary to sustain our mission. The pew beneath me seemed to tilt slightly, the floor swaying as if the building itself hesitated at his words. My fingers trembled again, and I pressed them together more tightly, willing my voice to remain silent. Richard Blackwell rose then, his voice clipped and professional, carrying the weight of numbers and spreadsheets no one else wanted to confront. "Preliminary estimates suggest that we could triple our income by renting the hall to paying clients. This would fund our programs without relying solely on donations." The words landed like cold stones. I felt the breath catch in my throat, the fragile fabric of hope unraveling with every syllable. I glanced at Sarah, who gazed back at me with eyes full of grief, the lines in her face deepening. "One must ask," Pastor Hampton added, his tone sharpening, "if unrestricted charity is sustainable. We are caretakers, yes, but we are also stewards of resources. We cannot allow sentimentality to undermine our responsibility." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat growing. The air was thick, almost suffocating. I could feel the eyes of the congregation weigh on me, some glancing nervously, others decisively, caught between support and doubt. Sarah's voice broke through the mounting tension, soft but unwavering. This hall is more than a building. It feeds the hungry, shelters the vulnerable, and gives hope. The room fell silent instantly, the kind of silence so thick it could be felt in the air, pressing on every shoulder. All eyes turned toward me, some with curiosity, others with anticipation, and a few with guarded hostility. I reached into my bag, the worn leather rough beneath my fingers, and pulled out the yellowed folder I had carried for decades. My hands, trembling slightly, unfolded the fragile document and laid it gently on the table between us. "This parish hall," I said, voice steady despite the tremor in my chest, "has never belonged to the church." Gasps rippled across the room. I could see the disbelief in Richard's eyes, the shock in Sarah's, and the sudden pale drain from Pastor Hampton's face. "This deed," I continued, "belongs to me and my late husband, Robert. We donated the use of this building to the church, yes, but never the ownership." I watched as Pastor Hampton reached out, almost instinctively, to snatch the document, scanning the fragile pages with a flicker of disbelief clouding his eyes. "This can't be," he muttered, voice tight and strained. Richard adjusted his glasses, voice barely audible as he read the deed. "Mrs. Bennet, this is legally binding. You and your husband have been the rightful owners all along." I felt the room shift beneath me, the weight of silence falling like a curtain. The tension, the anger, the uncertainty, all held in that breathless pause. Sarah reached out, squeezing my hand gently, tears glistening in her eyes. "Why didn't you say something before, Eleanor?" I swallowed hard, the years of quiet sacrifice pressing down on me. Robert believed that true service was humble, that charity needed no recognition. But now, I see that silence has allowed the spirit of this place to be threatened. The murmurs began, a low but growing hum of voices catching fire with questions, doubts, and slow awakening. Pastor Hampton looked up, meeting my gaze with something I hadn't seen before: defeat, perhaps regret. His carefully constructed vision now crumbling in the face of a truth he hadn't foreseen. My hands rested on the table, veins raised and skin thin with age, but in that moment they felt strong. The weight of decades of silence lifted just a little, replaced by a fragile hope. The room remained heavy with emotion, the echoes of our shared history and the possibilities for the future entwined in the quiet. I breathed in the rich scent of wood, the faint perfume of lilies, the muted light filtering through stained glass. All reminders of the faith, the community, and the legacy worth fighting for. And I knew, as the eyes of the congregation held mine, that this was only the beginning. The fight to protect the heart of Grace Eternal would not be easy, but for the first time in many years I was ready to stand and see it through. The room was taut with tension, the kind that presses into your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I could feel the eyes of everyone on me, and that weight, those decades of quiet, of holding back, was suddenly unbearable. My fingers brushed the worn leather of my purse, seeking the familiar comfort in its rough edges. The same purse Robert had seen me carry through countless meetings. It was time. The secret I'd carried for 40 years, like a fragile ember hidden beneath ash, needed to be brought to light. I reached in slowly, my hands trembling, and pulled out the yellowed folder, the one marked only by time and a faint crease from where it had been folded and unfolded over so many years. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the tremor in my voice as I broke the hush. "Pastor Hampton," I began, my voice low but steady, "there's something I need to say, something I should have said long ago." A hush fell over the room, so thick it seemed to swallow even the ticking of the clock. The polished oak table between us felt too broad, too cold. I rested the folder on its surface, the paper crackling softly as I unfolded the deed inside. The sunlight from the tall windows glinted faintly on the fragile ink, and I felt the weight of that fragile paper like a solid stone in my hands. "This parish hall," I said, my voice gaining strength with every word, has never belonged to the church. The words hung there like a bell tolling through the silence. I looked up, meeting the eyes of those around the table. Some stared in disbelief, others in shock. Pastor Hampton's face paled, the confident mask slipping for just a moment to reveal something raw beneath. Panic, maybe, or the sudden realization that the foundation beneath his plans was not as solid as he'd thought. Richard Blackwell, the treasurer, leaned forward, his lips parting in confusion. "What are you saying, Mrs. Bennet?" I lifted the deed gently, careful not to tear the brittle edges, and set it deliberately in the center of the table, right between us all. "This," I said, "is the legal deed. It shows that my late husband, Robert, and I are the rightful owners of the parish hall and the land it sits on. For 40 years we donated its use to the church, but ownership was never transferred." A ripple of murmurs rose around the room, but I silenced them with a quiet glance. "When Robert and I built this hall, we wanted it to serve the community. But we wanted to protect it, too, to make sure it would always be a place for people, not profit." Pastor Hampton's lips pressed into a thin line. Without a word, he reached out and snatched the deed, scanning the pages quickly. I saw the color drain from his face as he read, the disbelief etched deep in his eyes. "This can't be," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Richard adjusted his glasses, his hand shaking slightly as he took the document from the pastor. His voice lowered to a barely audible murmur, but everyone heard him. "This is legally binding. The ownership has been with you and Mr. Bennet all along." For moments the room was suspended in stunned silence. The neat arguments about rentals and fees, the talk of growth and modernization, all vanished like a fog lifting to reveal a landscape changed forever. I felt tears begin to stream down my cheeks, hot and unexpected. 40 years of quiet service, of sacrifice, and the secret I'd kept to protect a vision now laid bare in front of those who had forgotten why this place was built. Sarah's hand found mine under the table, gripping it tightly, her eyes shimmering with tears. "Why didn't you say anything before, Eleanor?" she asked softly. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat thickened by years of silence. Robert believed that true charity needed no recognition. He wanted this gift to be between us and God. But now, I see that silence allowed this place to be at risk of losing its soul. The emotions in the room shifted. Confusion turned to admiration for the courage it took to speak, but also to a deep, uncomfortable reckoning. Pastor Hampton looked up from the deed, his eyes meeting mine with a flicker of something I couldn't name. Regret, maybe. Or the dawning awareness that his vision for the church had overlooked the very essence of what had been entrusted to it. The air felt thick but also charged, as if a new possibility was unfolding, fragile but real. I thought of Robert then, his steady hand shaping each beam, his quiet faith building something more than a building. I felt his presence beside me, a gentle strength bolstering my resolve. "This hall is not just property," I said softly but firmly. "It's a promise, a covenant between the past and the future. And I intend to honor that promise." Slowly the murmurs began to grow, not of dissent but of questions, of hope. Some hesitated, unsure of what this revelation meant for them. Others, especially those who had shared in the hall's ministries, looked at me with newfound respect. I caught the eye of Deacon Matthew, whose youthful hope seemed to flicker in the dim light, the weight of leadership now tinged with the reality of this moment. The meeting ended with no grand resolutions, no sudden changes. But as we gathered our things, I felt the stirrings of a quiet shift, a new understanding that ownership was not just about deeds and documents, but about who holds the heart and soul of a community. Walking away from the table, I felt the burden of silence lift, replaced by a fragile hope that the hall, and the community it served, could still be protected. The path ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and hard conversations, but the truth was finally free. And sometimes that is enough to begin healing. In the days that followed, I signed papers to transfer ownership of the hall to a community foundation, an organization committed to preserving its original mission of service and faith. The deed was no longer just a document tucked away in a drawer. It became a beacon, a promise etched into the future of Millfield. The late afternoon sun poured gently through the stained glass windows of Grace Eternal Church, casting a kaleidoscope of colors onto the worn wooden floorboards. The parish hall, once filled with lively chatter and the hum of shared purpose, now sat quiet. Empty chairs lined the room in neat rows, their backs polished smooth by decades of hands that had held each other in prayer, that had folded food boxes with care, that had clutched trembling Bibles in hope and despair. I sat alone on the wooden bench near the entrance, the one that had cradled me through countless meetings, sermons, and silent moments of reflection. My fingers traced the grain of the bench, the grooves worn deep by time, and I felt the weight of years settle around me like a familiar shawl. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the ancient oaks that stood sentinel over this place. A whisper of life continuing, even as chapters close. The hall still smelled faintly of polished wood and lavender, the scent I had come to associate with home. Yet, in the quiet, there was a different kind of sound, the slow, steady rhythm of my own breathing, the soft rustle of pages turning in the Bible resting in my lap, and beyond these walls, the distant murmur of a world that moved on. I thought of Robert, the man whose hands had shaped these very walls, whose faith had been as solid as the oak beams that held the roof aloft. For 40 years we had carried this secret together, a hidden truth wrapped in quiet devotion. Now that secret was no longer mine alone to bear. It belonged to this community, to the many lives intertwined with these humble walls. The meeting, that tense day when the deed was laid on the table, had changed everything. Faces that had once argued over numbers now looked at me with something softer, a recognition of something lost and found again. I had spoken not just to claim ownership, but to reclaim the heart of a place that was never meant to be a ledger, a business, or a commodity. The days since had been quiet but full of subtle shifts. Pastor Hampton's sharp edges had softened, replaced by a wary respect. I sensed in him a reckoning with the truth he tried to sidestep. The younger members, once hesitant, now came to me with questions, curious, cautious, hopeful. Sarah's steady presence remained a constant, a reminder that faith is not just held in Scripture, but in friendship and shared struggle. Yesterday, I signed papers giving the hall to a community foundation dedicated to preserving its mission. It was a bittersweet moment, an end and a beginning intertwined. The plaque at the entrance, modest and unassuming, bore a simple inscription: Bennett Hall, where faith serves the community. Not a monument to pride, but a beacon of promise. I closed the Bible gently, the worn leather cover soft beneath my palms. Outside, footsteps echoed faintly in the corridor, a sign that life here still went on, carried forward by others who would steward this place with care. The church doors creaked open, a rush of warm air mingled with the scent of spring, and I felt a quiet peace settle over me. Rising slowly, I took one last look around the empty hall, the echoes of laughter, prayers, and songs lingering like a gentle breeze. I walked to the door, my steps measured and steady, the wooden floor cool beneath my shoes. As I reached the threshold, a gust of wind swept through, closing the heavy door softly behind me. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The oaks whispered once more, their leaves dancing in the fading light. I stood still for a moment, letting the calm wash over me, before turning to walk down the path toward home. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with questions and challenges I could not yet see. But I carried with me a quiet truth, that sometimes the greatest stewardship is not in what you give, but in what you protect. That the spirit of a place, like the faith within us, can endure beyond walls and deeds, resting in the hearts of those who believe. And as the last light faded from the sky, I whispered a prayer, not for endings but for grace to begin anew. The bench behind me sat empty now, a silent witness to what had been and what would be. The parish hall waited patiently, its doors closed but not forgotten, its spirit alive in every whispered prayer, every shared meal, every hand held in kindness. This was not a finale. It was a quiet turning, a passage from shadow into light, from silence into voice. And in that turning I found a fragile hope that the legacy of love, faith, and service would live on. The wind carried the soft echo of a closing door, a final note in the song of a place that had always been more than bricks and timber. It was a home, a sanctuary, a promise held in trust. And in that promise I found my peace. The late afternoon light softened as I stood at the edge of the empty parish hall, its walls gently holding the echoes of decades, echoes of whispered prayers, of laughter shared over community meals, of tears shed in moments of sorrow and hope. The room felt alive, not with the bustle of activity, but with something far more enduring, the spirit of a promise made and kept. I traced my fingers lightly across the worn oak door frame, feeling the coolness of the wood beneath my skin. The faint scent of lavender still lingered in the air, mingling with the faint, comforting aroma of polished timber and aged paper, the smell of memories of quiet devotion. It was a scent I had come to cherish, a reminder that even as walls fade and plans change, the heart of a place remains. For 40 years this hall had been more than a building. It was a sanctuary built with sweat and faith, with the hands of a man who believed in service without recognition, and a woman who held that faith steady when silence seemed easier. Together Robert and I had made a promise, not just to ourselves, but to every soul who would find refuge here, that this space would be a home for those in need, a place where faith met action without ledger or contract. The secret I carried for so long was no longer mine alone. It had been spoken aloud, laid bare in the quiet tension of a meeting room, and set free like a breath long held back. The deed, once folded away in a yellowed folder, had become a symbol, a shield to protect the very soul of this place from being lost to ambition or fear. I thought of the faces that had gathered that day, the shock, the disbelief, the slow unfolding of understanding. Pastor Hampton's sharp edges softened, the treasurer's calculative certainty shaken. And in the eyes of my friends, Sarah, Matthew, and the many others who stood beside me, the dawn of something new shimmered faintly. There would be challenges ahead, no doubt, questions about stewardship, about change, about what it truly means to tend to a community of faith. But I believe, deep in my heart, that stewardship is not measured by contracts or ownership alone. It is measured by the courage to protect what is sacred, by the willingness to speak truth when silence risks losing more than silence itself. As I turned away from the hall, the sun dipped lower, casting long warm shadows that stretched across the familiar path home. The oaks stood tall and steady, their leaves whispering ancient songs of endurance and grace. Somewhere in the quiet I felt Robert's presence, steady and sure, as if his hand still shaped not just wood, but the very future of this place. Faith is not just a quiet prayer. It is sometimes the loudest voice in a room filled with doubt, the trembling hands that raise a burden long hidden, the heart that refuses to let go when all seems lost. It is the promise we keep when no one is watching, and the legacy we leave when our time is done. This parish hall will stand, not just as a building, but as a testament to love, to service, and to the faith that endures beyond silence. And in that enduring faith I have found my peace. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.